Welcome back. The Doctor is in. This is part 5 of the Victoria War from BattleTech Historical Wars of the Republic era. In the previous parts, I discussed first how to organize the war and make sure that all of the regiments who took part were kept track of in terms of where they were and when and who they were fighting. Second, I covered the major personalities and why the war happened in the first place. Parts 3 and 4 dealt with the initial invasion by the Federated Sons, and then the subsequent invasion by two states of the former Free Worlds League, and the initial Capellan response to those invasions. Now let's go ahead and continue. So, after the initial counterattack against the invading Capellan March forces of the Federated Sons, and forces from the Oriente Protectorate and the Duchy of Andurian of the former Free Worlds League, the Capellans called on their Canopian allies. So the magistracy armed forces moved into Capellan territory using the jump ship chains that allowed the Capellans to shuffle their troops around so quickly in response to this invasion. After repelling the initial invasion, instead of simply counterattacking on the worlds that were invaded, the Canopians and the Capellans attacked into the Federated Sons itself, rather than simply attack the worlds that had been invaded. So instead of counterattacking, they actually counter-invaded. And the reason they did this is they understood that the troops in the invasion had been drawn from these other border worlds, leaving those border worlds vulnerable to a counterattack. So this, of course, went very badly. The Federated Sons had not anticipated the ability of the Capellans to move their personnel so quickly. Part of the reason they were able to do that is they had these jump ship chains, but also the Capellan Confederation has a much smaller territory to defend than the Federated Sons has. So because they don't have as far to travel, it's easier and faster for them to relocate from one side of the nation to the other, especially with the jump ship networks that they had established. Those same jump ship networks allowed the Canopians to move in from the magistracy and involve themselves directly in the fighting. And that is essentially what we're talking about here as far as the Capellan entry. Here we've got another of the maps showing where the troops went, which worlds were hit, where defenders tried to respond to these invasions. If you notice, the so-called Zhejiang salient and the Kittery Thumb were particularly focused on by the Capellans. They wanted to lop those thumbs, those salients, off from their territory, essentially to smooth out the border. And that's what you're seeing here. So, depending on whether the explosion is hollow with a dark planet or whether it is shaded with a light planet, indicates which planet was attacked by which side, and whether the world was captured or not. And here, this map is only showing Capellan troops, some of which were accompanied by Canopian troops. And essentially, this redirection of the war caught the Federated Sons by surprise. Here, because of the counter-invasion, the war could not be contained as far as scope, whereas Duchess Hasek of the Capellan March mounted the invasion without consultation of the national government because the Federated Sons had now been invaded on its own territory. The first prince of the Federated Sons had to take action. The Duchess only governs the Capellan March, which is part of the Federated Sons. she answers to the first prince, and he is now forced to look like an idiot because his troops were acting without his permission because of all the backroom dealing and the skullduggery that was going on. So we've got all the troops engaged on these worlds. Again, I'm limited as far as word count, so instead of devoting whole sections to some of these battles, they only get a paragraph. Essentially, we're discussing all of the worlds being hit and how the Capellans are overwhelming the Federated Suns defenders because most of the defenders were only planetary militias because those defending troops had been sent into the invasion force. And again, on the other side of the border, the former Free Worlds troops are still engaged because they invaded several worlds of the Capellan Confederation. The Capellans counterattacked with some of their best troops, drove some of them off right away. Here it discusses how some of the worlds were still contested at this point. And in the end, the Oriente troops had to retreat, just as the Andurian troops already had to from the worlds they invaded. Here we've now got a little bit more. Duchess Humphreys of the Andurian territory was particularly surprised when the Canopians entered the war. Those two powers had been allied at one point, 70 years earlier. Because the Andurians sent almost all of their military trying to seize territory from the Capellans, their own worlds were very vulnerable, and so when the Canopians attacked from the backside, they were overwhelmed. And just as the Andurians sent almost all of their military to attack the Capellans, the Canopians sent almost all of their military to aid the Confederation, either by attacking the Andurians directly or by moving into the Capellan Confederation to cooperate with the Capellans against the Federated Suns. And here we're just describing all of the worlds that were assaulted, and within a couple weeks, the Canopians seized 7 worlds, and others fell after that. And it was just a disaster for the Andurians. Here we talk about how they had to recall their military. They had been repelled from the Capellan worlds they took. Here we've got, now that the war is essentially over, we've got the new borders. So what I'm showing here are the borders prior to the war in the dashed lines, and the solid lines show what would be the borders by the time the Dark Age showed up. So those were the end point and the beginning points that I used when I organized the war to begin with. I discussed that in part 1 of this video series. What you see is the Federated Suns lost 5 worlds in the Zhejiang salient, and they lost 3 worlds of the Kittery Thumb. They gained 4 worlds, including Victoria, the target of the war, because of its factories, so it's a valuable world in the grand scheme of things. On the other side, you can see how the Capellans took 4 worlds from the Oriente Protectorate and 2 worlds from the Duchy of Andurian. So when you come into the accounting, in particularly against the former Free Worlds League, the Capellans were the victors of this war. They only gained territory. They didn't lose any territory to those former Free World states. Against the Federated Suns, yes, the Capellans took 8 worlds, but they lost 4, so they won in terms of number of worlds, but they lost Victoria, a factory world. None of the other worlds had factories, so in the grand scheme of things, the Capellans actually can be considered to have lost this war because they lost the primary prize of the war. Following all of the individual discussion of the battles for that final phase of the war, now comes the section that deals with the aftermath of the war. I made a point of noting how the mediation to end the war was handled by Carver Trondell, the former president of the Franc Reaches. If you recall, I wrote a lot of material for the Franc Reaches and the Periphery, including the bio for Carver Trondell in Masters and Minions and in other sources. So I just wanted to throw them into the mix as kind of a last diplomatic triumph for Carver Trondell, and how that intervention got a guarantee that Franc Reach's territory would not be invaded by Dao Shen Liao and his Capellan troops. We talk about how Duchess Amanda Hossek lost some of her autonomy because she mounted this invasion without permission and ended up making the first prince look like a fool because he didn't know what his own troops were doing. Those troops were disciplined, some of which was because they went willingly, others may have been deceived. I can't go too much into that. Again, we're limited on word count. However, we've got the aftermath also for the former Free Worlds League states. We talk about how the Federated Sons military was humiliated because of the deception and how their focus on the invasion left their other worlds vulnerable, and so they lost territory, they lost citizens, the Oriente Protectorate, the Magistracy, the Andurian Defense Force, everyone, that all of the initial defenders came through fairly well, especially in terms of morale and prestige. The Oriente troops ended up losing territory. The Andurians lost territory, a considerable amount of territory, because they're also a smaller nation. So they ended up looking the worst. And then there's the casualty list. These are always fun to put in place because, okay, you get to wipe out entire units. You know, those can have major lasting effects. However, some of this was strictly regulated in terms of what had already been established for the Dark Age period, so you can't just wipe out whoever because the future was already known. So if they hadn't been noted as destroyed, or if they were noted as still existing, you can't wipe them out. And you see, there are only a few 100% on here. There's a couple high. So 2 mercenary units, Thompson's August Warriors, which I created, Lethal Injection, which I did not. Those got wiped out. An Endurian unit got wiped out. 2 Federated Sons units. A Capellan unit. The Magistracy did not lose any units completely. The Oriente only had 4 regiments involved. They came through fairly minimal loss. And that is the end of the Victoria War. There are some gameplay units, special rules and stuff that occurred in the Rules Annex. I won't cover those. But this is the end of the Victoria War series. I hope you liked it. If you do, make sure you hit that like, maybe hit a subscribe if you're not already subscribed. So I know that you like this type of material and you want more of it. I don't know what my next BattleTech discussion will be. Let's find out together when I get the video put up. But for now, the Doctor is out.